The door had not opened in 14 months, not since the night the fire took everything Amos Stone had ever loved. And yet on a cold October morning in 1878, when a woman named Susan Bancroft knocked on it with her bare knuckles and her last shred of hope, he opened it without thinking, without deciding, as though his body had simply made a choice his grief-shattered mind had not yet caught up to. Susan had not planned to knock on that particular door. She had ridden 3 days from Amarillo, Texas. With a broken wagon wheel she had fixed herself using a strip of leather from her boot, and a prayer she was not entirely sure she believed in anymore. She had planned to stop at the general store in the town of Crail's Hollow, buy what she needed, and ride on to the homestead her late father had left her in his will, a parcel of land 7 miles east of town that she had never seen and could not yet picture. But the general store owner, a wire-thin man named Calloway with a waxed mustache and suspicious eyes, had told her to speak to the man on the hill if she needed a place to stay the night, because the boarding house had burned down the previous spring and the town had not yet rebuilt it. Which man on the hill? Susan had asked. Only one that matters, Calloway had said, and he had not explained further. So she had ridden her roan mare up the winding dirt path to a low stone house that sat against the hill like it had grown there, with a cold chimney and dark windows and a porch that bore the ghost of a rocking chair someone had taken inside and never brought back out. She had hitched her horse to the post, walked up the 3 wooden steps and knocked. Once, twice, then a third time, firm and deliberate, because Susan Bancroft had never in her life let silence be the final answer. The door opened. The man standing in its frame was tall enough to have to dip his head slightly at the top of the doorway, though the doorway was not particularly low. He had dark hair that was longer than was fashionable, and a beard that was not quite trimmed but was not wild either, as though he had shaved once several weeks ago and then stopped caring. His eyes were brown, the kind of brown that is almost amber when the light hits it right, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. It was not hostile. It was not warm. It was something closer to bewilderment, the way a man looks when something happens that he had not prepared for and does not know whether to be grateful for or afraid of. "I need a place to sleep," Susan said, because she was practical before she was polite, and she had been on the road for 3 days. The man at the store said you might have room. Amos Stone stared at her for a moment that stretched like taffy in summer heat. Then he stepped back from the door, not all the way, but enough. "I have a spare room," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, as though he had not used it much lately, which in fact he had not. Susan picked up her saddlebag from where she had set it on the porch and walked inside. The house was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Not orderly in the way of someone who had a housekeeper or a wife to manage things, but clean in the way of someone who spent hours doing tasks, because tasks kept the mind occupied. The floors were swept. The windows, though dark from outside, were not dirty. There was a stone fireplace on the north wall that was laid with wood but unlit, and a kitchen to the east, and 2 doors leading presumably to bedrooms. A single chair sat at the table in the main room, not 2 chairs, not 4-1, which told her more about the last 14 months of this man's life than anything Calloway at the store might have said. "I'm Susan Bancroft," she said. "My father left me land east of town. I'm on my way to look at it." "Amos Stone," he said. He had closed the door behind her and was standing near it still, as though keeping himself close to the exit, or to the option of opening it again. She was not sure which. "I'll be gone by morning," she said. "I won't be any trouble." He nodded once and moved toward the kitchen. "I can heat some stew," he said. "It's not much." "Hot stew after 3 days on the road is everything," she said honestly. Something shifted in his expression then, just barely, a slight softening around the eyes. He turned to the kitchen, and she stood in the main room and looked at the 1 chair, and at the empty space at the table where other chairs had perhaps once stood, and she thought about what it meant to be a person who had removed every extra seat from a room. She thought about grief, and about the shapes it takes in the spaces people leave behind. She did not ask. It was not the time for asking. She set her saddlebag near the spare room door and came to the table and sat in the one chair. And when he brought 2 bowls of stew, she saw him hesitate for only a second before he pulled a second chair from beside the wall, a chair that had been turned to face the wall, and set it at the other end of the table. He sat down, and they ate in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silences between strangers usually are. It was more like the silence between 2 people who are both too tired to pretend. The stew was venison. It was good. "Thank you for opening the door," she said, when the bowls were nearly empty. He looked at her across the table. "I don't know why I did," he said. "Does it matter?" she asked. He considered that for a moment, turning his spoon in the bowl. "No," he said finally. "I suppose it doesn't." Outside, the wind had picked up the way it does in West Texas in October, not cold enough to be cruel, but cold enough to remind you that winter is not far. The chimney in the spare room had a flue that worked, Amos told her, and he laid a small fire for her before she went to bed. She watched him do it, watched the way his hands moved with the flint and steel, efficient and careful, and she noticed that he kept his face turned slightly away from the flames when they caught, the way a man does when fire means something more than warmth to him. She did not ask that night either. She slept deeply and without dreaming, the way a body sleeps when it has finally put itself down after too long a journey, and when she woke in the morning the light was thin and gray through the window and she could smell coffee. He had made coffee. She came into the kitchen and found him standing at the stove with a tin cup in his hands, looking out the small window above the basin at the hills to the east. He did not hear her come in, or if he did not acknowledge it immediately, and she had a moment to look at him without him knowing he was being looked at. He was about 30, she thought, maybe a year or 2 past it. He had the build of a man who had done hard physical work all his life, broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, with hands that were weathered and scarred in the small ways that come from ranching and roping. He was wearing a plain cotton shirt, dark gray, and his boots were already on, which meant he had been up for hours. There was a sadness in the line of his back that she recognized the way you recognize a thing you have felt yourself. "Good morning," she said. He turned, and the sadness was still there but covered now, the way you cover a sore place with your sleeve. "Coffee's on," he said. She poured herself a cup and they stood on opposite sides of the kitchen and drank, and after a while she said, "I should look at the land today. Do you know the Bancroft parcel east of town?" His expression changed. It was subtle, but she was watching. "I know it," he said. "Is it bad?" "It hasn't been worked in years," he said carefully. "The well needs clearing. The cabin is standing, but the roof on the east side has let in weather." "Is it fixable?" He looked at her steadily. "Most things are," he said, "if you're willing to work." "I am," she said. He believed her. She did not know why he believed her so immediately, but she could see that he did, and she found she was glad of it because she had not been believed easily for most of her adult life. She was 28 years old and had been a school teacher in Amarillo for 5 years before her father died and left her the land, and she had made the decision, faster than she had expected to make it, that she would rather try to make something of the land than keep standing in front of a classroom pretending that the 4 walls around her were enough. "I'll ride out with you if you want a second pair of eyes," Amos said, and then stopped, as though surprised at himself. She looked at him. He looked at the coffee in his cup. "I'd like that," she said. They rode out at mid-morning, Susan on her roan mare and Amos on a big bay gelding that was clearly his working horse, steady and calm and well-trained. He had saddled the gelding without comment, and they had ridden down the hill and east along the old wagon road that ran past the edge of town, and Calloway at the general store had watched them pass from his porch with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something else Susan might have called relief, if she had known the town's history better. She did not know the town's history yet, but she was beginning to learn it. The Bancroft land was 7 acres of dry Texas grassland with a crease of creek running along its southern edge, and a stand of post oaks at the north end that would provide good shade in summer. The cabin was a 2-room affair built of cedar logs, And Amos had been right that the east roof had taken damage. There were 3 boards that had buckled under a wet winter and not been replaced, but the rest of the structure was sound. Susan walked through it with her hands on the walls and her eyes on the ceiling, the way her father had taught her to inspect a thing, not with hope or dread but with honesty. "I can fix this," she said. Amos was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and the morning light was behind him and she could not quite read his face. "You do it alone?" he asked. "I've done harder things alone," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said, and it did not sound like the kind of thing a man says to be polite. It sounded like the kind of thing a man says when he means it. They walked the creek together. It was down from drought but not dry, which was a mercy, and the well at the south side of the cabin yard was indeed silted up but not collapsed, which meant it could be cleared with a morning's work and proper tools. There were the remnants of a small vegetable garden on the west side, gone to seed and weeds, but the soil beneath was dark and good when she dug her fingers into it. "My father was here?" she asked. She had not known him well, her father. He had left her mother and her when Susan was 9, gone west with a dream and a shovel and a stubbornness that she had apparently inherited without asking. He had sent letters every Christmas and money when he had it and an apology once, just once, in a letter that arrived the spring she turned 21, and that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold lines. "Jacob Bancroft," Amos said. He was standing by the creek looking at the water. He came through Crail's Hollow about 10 years ago, built the cabin himself, worked the land alone for a long time. He paused. "He used to come by the ranch sometimes. My father and yours, they were friendly." Susan looked at him. "Your father's ranch, the Stone Ranch," Amos said, and his voice changed when he said it just slightly. "It was 3 miles north of here before the fire." There it was, the fire. He had said it himself without her asking, and she could see it cost him something to say, but that he had chosen to say it rather than carry it alone in that moment, which told her something about him. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the reflexive kind of sorry, the kind people say when they don't know what else to offer. The kind that means she understood that what had been lost could not be replaced and she would not pretend otherwise. He nodded once and looked at the creek. "It was 14 months ago," he said. "November of 77. My father, my mother, and my younger brother. They were inside when it started. I was at the barn." He stopped. "By the time I got to the house it was all ready." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Susan did not reach for him or fill the silence with words. She simply stood beside him and let the creek make its quiet sound and let the wind move through the oaks and let him be in the truth of it without feeling like he had to move away from it. After a while he said quietly, "I haven't talked about it out loud to anyone." "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the strange part." They rode back to his place in the late afternoon because her roan had thrown a shoe on the creek path and needed to be reshod before she could ride back to town. And Amos had a forge in the small smithy beside the house that he still used. One of the few parts of his old life he had kept going because animals needed it whether a man's heart was whole or not. She watched him shoe the horse. She had watched shoeing done before, but never by a man who moved with that particular combination of precision and gentleness, who spoke to the mare in a low, even voice while he worked, and never once hurried or forced. The roan, who was famously difficult about her feet and had bitten 2 men in Amarillo, stood placid as a Sunday afternoon. "She likes you," Susan said. "Horses always know," he said. He was bent to the last nail, driving it home with clean strokes. "Know what?" He set the hoof down and straightened and looked at the mare for a moment. "Whether or not you're afraid of them," he said. "Are you afraid of horses?" she asked. "No," he said. "Never been afraid of horses." He looked at her then directly, and the amber was very clear in his eyes in the late afternoon sun. "Other things," he said, and left it there. She stayed a second night. Not because the mare needed it, the shoeing was done by sundown, but because Amos had said, without ceremony, that the road to town was better ridden in daylight, and she might as well eat something first, and the something first became supper, and the supper was longer than supper usually was because they were talking by the time the food was done, and neither of them was ready to stop. He told her about the ranch, about what it had been before. 300 acres of good grazing land, a herd of 200 longhorns, horses they had bred themselves from a foundation mare his grandfather had brought from Tennessee, a working operation that had taken 3 generations to build. Now there was only the stone house, which was far enough from the barn and the main ranch buildings that it had not caught, and the small forge, and the 7 acres of pasture he kept fenced where he ran a handful of horses. "Do you have help?" she asked. "A hand named Deke comes out twice a week," he said. "Mostly I manage it myself. Do you plan to rebuild?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it," he said, "but it's hard to plan for a future when the people you were building it with are gone." She understood that. She understood it in the way of someone who had spent years building a life that looked like it had direction and purpose, and then learned that the direction had always been away from something rather than towards something. "You have to build it for yourself eventually," she said. "Not for them, for you." He looked at her across the table, really looked at her, the way he had not quite allowed himself to look before. "You sound like someone who's been working that out herself," he said. "I have been," she said. "My whole life, practically." "Why did you come here?" he asked. "Really, not the land. You could have sold the land and stayed in Amarillo." It was a fair question and a direct one, and she respected it. "Because I wanted to find out if I could make something real," she said. "Not just manage things, not just maintain. Actually build something and watch it grow." "That's a brave reason," he said. "Or a stubborn one," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to smiling in the 2 days she had known him, and she catalogued it without meaning to, filed it away as something she would like to see again. She slept again in the spare room, and in the morning there was coffee again, and this time he had also made biscuits, which were not beautiful biscuits but were honest ones, flour and lard and a little salt, the kind of biscuit that fills you up and asks no questions. She told him she was riding to the land. He said he had some cedar boards in the smithy that were left from a repair he had done on the fence posts, and she was welcome to them. She said she would take them and pay him for them. He said he would not take her money for them. They went back and forth on this for a few minutes in the way that 2 proud people negotiate the terms of receiving help, and they settled eventually on the understanding that she would take the boards and he would not take money, and they would call it even on account of the stew and the biscuits, which she pointed out had been his doing and not any particular favor to her, which made him make the almost smile again. She loaded the boards on the roan, which was patient about it, and rode to the land. She spent the first week there alone. She cleared the well, which took 2 full days of hard pulling and patience. She replaced the broken roof boards with the cedar, and though her carpentry was not fine, it was solid, and the roof held against the rain that came through on Thursday. She cut back the dead growth around the vegetable garden and turned the soil with a spade she bought from Callaway at the store. She drew water from the creek with a bucket until the well was clear enough to use. Callaway, she had learned, was not a bad man but was a cautious one. He had watched the town of Crail's Hollow diminish over the past few years as the railroad went 15 miles north instead of through town as had been hoped, and the loss of that commerce had made him careful about newcomers the way a man who has been cheated gets careful about handshakes. He was not unfriendly to Susan, but he was not warm, and she accepted that and made no particular effort to charm him because she did not have the patience for it. There were about 80 people in Crail's Hollow in the autumn of 1878. There was a blacksmith named Cooper who was different from Amos's small forge operation and ran the town's main smithy, a woman named Hetty Prout who did the washing for 3/4 of the town and knew every piece of news before it was properly news, and a preacher named Aldridge who gave sermons on Sundays in the schoolhouse because there was no church building. There was a small Mexican community on the south end of town, families who had been in that part of Texas since before the American settlers came and who were regarded with a mixture of respect and the kind of casual dismissal that Susan recognized and found repugnant. There was Marta Vega, who made the best tortillas in 3 counties and who looked at Susan on their first meeting with sharp, dark eyes and then nodded once as though she had made a decision about her. "You are the Bancroft daughter," Marta said. "I am," said Susan. "Your father was a good man," Marta said. "He brought wood for my grandfather when the winter was bad. He did not talk about it. He just brought it." Susan held that information close. It was the best thing she had learned about her father, and she was grateful to have it. Amos came to the land on the 4th day. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared in the yard on the big bay gelding with a roll of wire in one saddlebag and a post digger across his back, and he looked at what she had done with the roof and the well and the garden, and something in his expression was close to impressed. "The well is clear?" he asked. "Pulled it out yesterday," she said. "Come look." He came and looked and drew water and tasted it and said it was good, clean groundwater, no bitterness. "I thought you might need help fencing the east side," he said. "The deer will eat your garden straight down to roots if you don't run a line." She looked at the wire and the post digger. "Did you bring those for me?" "Brought them for the fence," he said, which was not quite an answer. They fenced the east side of the garden together that afternoon, she holding the posts while he tamped them, both of them working without much talk but with the particular ease of 2 people who have found a rhythm together and do not need to comment on it. The sun dropped behind the hill to the west and the air went cool and gold, and they stood back and looked at the fence and it was good and straight and adequate. "Thank you," she said. "You would have done it yourself," he said. "Probably next week," she agreed. "This is faster." He helped her more after that. Not every day, not in a way that could be called intrusive, but in the way of a neighbor who has noticed a need and has the means to help with it. He brought more lumber for a linta she wanted to build on the south side of the cabin. He showed her where the best grass for a small vegetable plot was, based on the angle of the afternoon sun. He explained which sections of the creek ran strongest in dry years so she would know where to pull water from in a drought. And she helped him in return, because she was not a woman who took without giving. She had a hand for numbers, and when she discovered he was behind on his records from the past year, the accounts and tallies a small operation needs to keep, she spent 2 evenings going through them with him and organizing them in a way that made sense, not intrusively, not without asking, but firmly and clearly. He watched her work with an expression she could not quite name. Later she decided it was something like gratitude mixed with something newer and more uncertain. Hetty Prout had opinions about all of this, as Hetty Prout had opinions about most things. She told Calloway, who told Cooper the blacksmith, who mentioned it casually to Amos when Amos came in for nails one afternoon, that it was a fine thing to see Amos Stone getting out of that house of his, and a fine thing to see the Bancroft place being worked, and wasn't it interesting how those 2 things seemed to be happening at the same time? Amos bought his nails and said nothing in particular, and Cooper grinned at his anvil. The truth was that Amos had not been able to explain to himself, in the 3 weeks since Susan had knocked on his door, why he had opened it, and furthermore why he kept finding reasons to ride east 7 miles. He had told himself it was neighborly duty. He had told himself it was because Jacob Bancroft had been his father's friend and Jacob Bancroft's daughter was alone and new to the land. He had told himself he was simply doing what any decent man would do. But he knew, in the part of himself he had kept very quiet and very still since the fire, that it was not duty and it was not history and it was not obligation. It was that she had knocked on his door with her bare knuckles and her roan horse and her 3 days on the road. And when he had opened the door she had looked at him, not through him, not past him, not at his grief as though it were an interesting feature of the landscape, but at him, the actual man, and she had said simply that she needed a place to sleep, and he had felt, for the first time in 14 months, like he was a person who was present in the world rather than one who was waiting for it to end. He was not ready to say that to her. He was not ready to say it to himself. But it was there, and growing, the way a fire builds from a small start if the wood is dry, and the conditions are right, and something strikes the flint at exactly the right moment. November came. The temperature dropped in the way it does in West Texas, which is not the bitter killing cold of further north but is cold enough to matter, cold enough to make you grateful for a fire and company. Susan had the cabin weathered well by then, with the new boards holding and the chimney drawing cleanly, and a good stack of wood she had split herself over the previous 2 weeks with an axe she had bought from Callaway. Amos came on a Tuesday, and she could tell something was different when he rode in. He was quieter than usual, which for Amos Stone was saying something, and the line of his jaw was tight. "What is it?" she asked, because she had learned that with Amos the direct approach was always the right one. He dismounted and stood with his horse's reins in his hands and looked at the cabin. "I went to the old site today," he said. "The ranch, first time since I buried them." She went still. "Was that hard?" she said. "Yes," he said. She took the reins from him because his hands were shaking just slightly, and she did not comment on it. She just took the reins and tied the bay to the post and came back to him. "Come inside," she said. He sat at the small table in the cabin, the one she had found folded in the corner and set up, and she made coffee from the pot on the stove, and she put a cup in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. "The chimney is still standing," he said after a while. "Everything else is ash and ruin, but the stone chimney is standing. I don't know why I expected different. Stone doesn't burn." "What did you feel when you saw it?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed at the cabin walls, a sound that was not quite sound but more a feeling of pressure and release. "I felt like I had to start somewhere," he said. "Like that was the place. That if I could stand there and not fall apart, then maybe I could think about what to do next." "Did you fall apart?" He met her eyes. "Almost," he said. "And then I thought about riding here and it helped." She heard what was in that. She heard it clearly, the way you hear a note that is perfectly tuned. Her heart moved in her chest in a way that was specific and new, and she recognized it for what it was even as she was not entirely prepared for it. "Amos," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's fast. Or not fast, I don't know what it is. I haven't. It's been a long time since I've been a person who thinks about anything like this." He stopped and looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. "I'm not entirely sure what to do with it." "Neither am I," she said honestly, "but I'm not opposed to finding out." He looked at her with those amber eyes in the firelight of her little cabin, and something in him seemed to loosen, something that had been pulled very tight for 14 months. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. "I'd like to take you to supper," he said. "In town, if you'd like that. You want to give Hetty Prout something to actually talk about," she said, and the corners of his mouth pulled up, and this time it was not the almost smile. It was the real thing, and she felt it land in her chest like something warm and heavy and welcome. "I do," he said. They went to supper at the only establishment in Crayle's Hollow that served meals in the evening, which was the back room of the saloon, where a large and formidable woman named Bertie Graves held court over a cast-iron stove, and produced meals that were better than they had any right to be given the circumstances. Bertie served them elk steak and roasted potatoes, and a kind of apple cake that Susan ate 2 slices of and was not ashamed about. The saloon was not a rough place, or not rougher than most small Texas towns in 1878. There was drinking and there was card playing and there was occasional disagreement, but Crayle's Hollow was not a cattle drive town. It was a farming and ranching community, and the men in it mostly went home to wives and children rather than sleeping off trouble in the street. There were a few hard-eyed men who passed through from time to time and gave Susan the cautious feeling she had learned to trust. But on the evening she and Amos had supper there, the mood was quiet and warm, and Bertie brought the coffee herself and gave Amos a long look that was full of something complicated and kind. "Good to see you out," Bertie said, and she said it simply without embellishment, and he nodded. "Good to be out," he said, and it sounded like he meant it. Hetty Prout, who had apparently developed a supernatural ability to know when things were happening, materialized at the door of the back room within 20 minutes of their arrival, and greeted them with a warmth that was not calculated but was definitely informed by curiosity. She was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with strong hands and sharp hazel eyes and a way of talking that was friendly and relentless simultaneously. "Susan Bancroft," she said, "I heard you cleared that well yourself. Is that true?" "It is," said Susan. "Lord in heaven," said Hetty. She looked at Amos. "She cleared that well herself," she told him as though he did not know. "I know," said Amos. "Smart woman," said Hetty. She looked back at Susan. "You'll do all right out here," she said, and then moved on with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. After supper they walked out to the horses, and the night sky above Crail's Hollow was enormous and cold and full of stars, the kind of sky that makes you feel very small and very alive simultaneously. Susan stood with her coat pulled close and her face tilted up, and Amos stood beside her and looked at the sky too. "I used to do this as a boy," he said. "Come out to the south pasture and lie on my back and look at the stars. My mother used to say it was wasteful. My father said it was necessary." "Your father was right," she said. "He was right about most things," Amos said. There was grief in his voice, but it was softer now, the way grief changes when you've allowed yourself to speak it. It was not the raw, jagged grief of the early days. It was the kind that has been lived with long enough to become part of you without destroying you. He walked her to her mare and held the reins while she mounted, and she looked down at him from the saddle, and in the starlight his face was upturned and open in a way it had not been when she first knocked on his door. "Thank you for supper," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. She rode back to the land and lay in her bunk in the cabin and looked at the ceiling and thought about the smile, the real one, and about the way he had said that thinking about riding to her place had helped him through the hard moment at the ruins of the ranch. She thought about the amber in his eyes and the way his hands were gentle with her mare. She thought about the chair turned to face the wall and the cold chimney and the door that had not opened since the fire. She thought about what it meant that he had opened it for her, without knowing why. She thought it might mean the most important thing she had ever been told. December arrived, and with it the preparations for a hard winter. Susan laid in supplies with careful economy, buying what she needed from Callaway and learning from Marta Vega which preserved foods kept best and how to pack a root cellar, which the Bancroft cabin had, a small one dug under the floor planks, and which she stocked with the last of the autumn squash and dried beans, and a ham she bought from the Prout family who kept pigs. Amos came 4 times that week, and she noticed she had stopped counting his visits as individual events and had started thinking of them as simply a part of how her days went. She was not sure when that had happened, but she was not troubled by it. She was a woman who paid attention to her own interior in the way that a rancher pays attention to the weather, not obsessively but honestly, noting what was changing and what it might mean. He brought her a Christmas tree. That was the thing that undid her, or rather it was the thing that clarified what had already been done. It was not a grand gesture, it was a small one. A cedar branch about 3 feet tall that he had tied to a stand made from 2 scrap boards, and he set it on the table in the cabin and looked at it critically, and said it was probably the worst Christmas tree in Crail's Hollow, and she could throw it out if she wanted. She did not throw it out. She hung bits of dried orange peel and a scrap of red ribbon on it, and set a candle behind it, and the cabin smelled like cedar for a week. He stayed that evening and they sat by the fire, and she read aloud from a book she had brought from Amarillo, a collection of poems that she had carried in her saddlebag since the day she left, and that she had not read aloud to anyone in years because there had been no one to read to. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fire, and when she finished a particular poem, one that was about the way spring feels when you have survived a long winter, he said quietly, "Read that one again." She read it again. He was quiet the whole time, and when it was done he looked at her across the small distance of the cabin fire. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you something," he said, and I want to say it straight because I'm not a man who is particularly good at the other way." "I know," she said. "Tell me." "I have not felt anything like this in a very long time," he said. "I had felt nothing at all for 14 months, and then you knocked on my door and I don't know why I opened it, like I told you from the start, but I know that I'm glad. I am very glad that you were the person standing there." She set the book of poems down on her knee and looked at him, this large, quiet man with the scarred hands and the almost smile that had turned into a real smile, and the amber eyes that were looking at her right now with a directness and a gravity that made her heart do the thing it had been doing increasingly for weeks. "I am glad too," she said. "I rode 3 days in the wrong season on a horse who didn't want to go, and I ended up in a town I had never been to and knocked on the door of a man I had never met, and I think it might be the best thing I ever did." He moved from his chair to hers in the way a deliberate man moves, not impulsively but with intention, and he sat on the edge of the hearth beside her chair and took her hand in both of his. And they sat like that with the fire between them and the cedar tree behind them and the West Texas winter wind pushing at the walls. And it was warm and it was quiet and it was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing you spend a long time not being sure you will ever have, and then you have it. And it is so simple and so profound that you almost don't know what to do with yourself. He did not kiss her that night. That was not because he was reluctant, but because he was thorough, which is a different thing entirely. He was a man who believed that the things worth having were worth being careful with, and what was building between them was very much worth being careful with. He kissed her the following Sunday. They had ridden together to the ruins of the Stone Ranch, which he had decided to revisit, and this time he had asked her to come with him, and she had come. They had stood together at the edge of the ash and ruin with the lone chimney rising from it and the winter sky flat and blue above them, and she had put her hand in his arm and stood beside him while he looked at it, while he breathed through it, while he let himself be sad without apologizing for it. After a long time he turned to her and said, "I think I want to rebuild it." "I think you should," she said. "I'd need help," he said. "Real help, not just deke twice a week." "Then ask for it," she said. "The town would come, you know that." "I know," he said. He looked at her. "I want to ask you something else first." She waited. "I want to ask if you would consider," he said slowly, choosing every word the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground, "whether what is happening between us is the kind of thing that might go somewhere lasting." Susan looked at him for a moment. The wind was moving his dark hair slightly, and his eyes were very clear and very steady, and the chimney stood behind him like it was bearing witness. "I'm not interested in the other kind," she said. He put his hands on either side of her face, very gently, and kissed her once, briefly and precisely, and it was the kind of kiss that is a beginning rather than a statement. When he drew back, she was looking up at him, and he was looking down at her, and between them was something that had the particular solidity of a thing that has been built on honesty. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good." Hetty Prout heard about the outing to the Stone Ranch ruins by the following morning. She did not hear about the kiss because Amos Stone was not the kind of man who told Hetty Prout things, but she heard the rest, and she told Marta Vega and Bertie Graves and Cooper the blacksmith, and within 48 hours it was a known fact in Crail's Hollow that Amos Stone and the Bancroft woman were keeping company, and the general feeling was that this was an event worth being glad about. Not everyone was glad. There were 2 men in town, brothers named Tate and Harlan Cruz, who had been watching the Bancroft land since Jacob Bancroft's death with an eye toward acquiring it. Jacob Bancroft had left no mortgage on the land, but he had left a small unpaid debt to Tate Cruz from a dispute about fencing several years prior, a debt that Tate Cruz had inflated considerably in the telling of it, and had been quietly intending to press against the estate, counting on there being no heir to push back. Susan's arrival had complicated this. Her presence on the land and her obvious intention to work it had made Tate's quiet plan more difficult, and the fact that she now had the company and apparent support of Amos Stone, who was not a man to be trifled with on account of both his reputation and his size, made it more difficult still. Tate Cruz came to the Bancroft land on a cold January morning and found Susan in the yard splitting wood and told her about the debt. He was a broad-faced man of about 45 with pale eyes and a manner that was outwardly civil in the way of a man who uses civility as a tool. He said the debt was $80 and was owed on account of a fence line dispute in 1873, and he produced a paper that he said was documentation of it. Susan set down her axe and took the paper and read it. She was a former schoolteacher who could read carefully and quickly, and she read the paper 3 times while Tate Cruz stood and watched her with those pale eyes. "This is dated 1875, she said, "and it says the amount was $20. "Interest," said Tate Cruz. "300% interest over 3 years is not a legal instrument," she said. "It's a scheme." Tate Cruz's face went hard. "Your father agreed to it," he said. "My father is dead," she said, "and this document does not bear his signature on the interest terms, only on the original $20, and $20 I might consider paying if you can show me any legal basis for the claim. But you cannot, because there is none, and I suggest you take this paper and go home, Mr. Cruz." Tate Cruz stared at her for a long moment, and then he rode away without another word, which was not the same as going away. She told Amos that evening. He listened without interrupting, and his jaw was doing the tight thing it did when he was controlling something. "Tate Cruz has been trouble in this valley for 15 years, he said. "He's welcome to be trouble as long as he stays off my land," she said. "He won't come back alone," Amos said. "Then we'll deal with 2 of them," she said. He looked at her with something that was equal parts exasperation and admiration. "Susan," he said. "Amos," she said. "I'm going to talk to the sheriff in Hale County tomorrow," he said. "There's a circuit judge who comes through in February. We should put what happened on record." "That's sensible," she said. "I'll write it down tonight." "You'll write it down tonight," he said, as though confirming something to himself. "Of course you will." "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "No," he said. "It is in fact the opposite of a complaint." He brought his chair closer to the table and helped her write it. Not the words, which were hers, but the structure of the argument, since he knew the local law and history better than she did. And they sat together at the small table with the candle between them and the February cold held off by the fire, and it was domestic and purposeful, and she thought, "This is what I meant. This is exactly what I meant when I said I wanted to build something real." The circuit judge came through Crayle's Hollow in late February and heard the matter in Calloway's back room, which was the nearest thing to a courthouse the town had. Susan presented her documentation and her argument clearly and without embellishment. Tate Cruz presented his paper, and the judge looked at it for about 2 minutes, and then said that the $20 claim might have standing if properly documented, but the interest terms were not legally enforceable, and he was dismissing the inflated portion and recommending that the $20 claim be settled directly. Susan paid $20 from her winter savings, and Tate Cruz took it with a face like curdled milk and said nothing that could be heard by the judge. Outside, after, Amos put his hand on her back for a moment and said quietly, "Well done." "It was just sense," she said. "Sense is harder than it looks," he said. Winter began to loosen in March. The days grew longer and the ground softened, and the creek rose a little with the snowmelt from the hills to the north. Susan had planted the vegetable garden in the last week of February with the hardiest seeds, onions and early peas, and the first green shoots were showing by the middle of March, and she felt a pride in them that was out of proportion to their size, but was not out of proportion to what they represented. Amos came on a Thursday in late March, and he had a look about him that she had not seen before, a sort of concentrated energy, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said, "I talked to 6 men in town this week about rebuilding the ranch." She looked at him. "What did they say?" "They said they'd come," he said. "Cooper, Deke, the Prout brothers, Marta Vega's son Roberto, and Calloway." He paused. "Calloway surprised me." "Calloway is not a bad man," she said. "Just a careful one," He said he thought it was time, Amos said. He said the valley needs more working ranches. He said he stopped, and a brief expression moved across his face that she recognized as the kind of emotion that catches you when someone's kindness is unexpectedly large. He said my father was a good neighbor and he should have said so before. Susan felt the sting of that in the back of her throat. Will you build it the same? She asked. Similar, he said. The house I won't move. It's stone and it stood, but the barn and the working buildings, and eventually the herd. He looked at her steadily. I need to ask you something while I'm asking things. Ask, she said. When I rebuild, he said, would you consider whether there is any possibility? He stopped, and for the first time she saw him genuinely uncertain, this large, steady man who chose every word like a stone being placed in a wall. He started again. I would like very much if you were willing to build this thing as something that belongs to both of us. I know that's, he cleared his throat. What I am asking, Susan, is whether you will marry me. She stood in her yard in the March sunshine with her hands covered in garden soil and her hair down from its pin, because she had been working since morning. And Amos Stone was standing in front of her with his hat in his hands and his heart completely visible in his face. And she thought about the door that had not opened, and the man behind it, and the morning of coffee made without being asked, and the real smile and the Christmas tree and the kiss at the chimney ruins, and the way he had sat beside her chair and held her hand and been present and steady and true for every month of this strange and unexpected season. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Good, he said. You keep saying that, she said. Because it keeps being true, he said, and he crossed the yard to her and kissed her properly, with both hands on her face and the morning sun on both of them and the smell of turned earth and cedar and spring in the air around them. They were married in April, in the schoolhouse that served as Crayle's Hollow's church on Sundays, with preacher Aldridge officiating and what felt like most of the town in attendance. Marta Vega brought tamales for the reception, and Bertie Graves made a 3-layer cake that was frankly magnificent, and Hetty Prout cried with the unreserved enthusiasm of a woman who has been vindicated in all her best hopes. Susan wore the blue dress she had brought from Amarillo, the one she had not yet worn, because when she had packed it she had not known why she was packing it, and now she understood that she had been packing it for this. Amos wore the good black coat that had been his father's, which he had kept in the Stone house through everything, and he stood at the front of the schoolhouse with Deke beside him as his witness, and watched her walk toward him with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck, but is determined to deserve it. Calloway gave her away at her request because she had no male family and he had been the one to point her toward the hill, and the rightness of that made something close in his narrow face that might have been tears if Calloway had been the crying sort. I do, said Amos Stone. I do, said Susan Bancroft, who would now be Susan Stone. They rode home to the Stone house together in the late afternoon, because she had moved her things from the Bancroft cabin the week before, and the Stone house was now both of theirs in all the ways that mattered. She had put her book of poems on the shelf, and her spare chairs at the table and her dried herbs in the kitchen, and the house had changed without being asked, the way a house changes when more than one life is being lived in it. The Bancroft land they leased to Roberto Vega, Marta's son, who was 23 and hardworking, and had been looking for a place to start his own operation. The arrangement was fair and flexible, and Susan kept the deed in her own name, which was her right and which Roberto respected completely. The rebuilding of the Stone ranch began in May. Amos had drawn plans through the winter months, careful measured drawings in a hand that was surprisingly precise for a man who called himself a rancher, and the 6 men came on the first Saturday and they began. Susan cooked for the work crew all 3 days of that first weekend, alongside Marta, who brought her daughter and her daughter-in-law, and the smell of food and the sound of hammers and the sight of walls going up where ash had been was something that Susan felt in her bones as right and true and earned. Amos would stop sometimes during those days and stand back from the work and look at what was rising, and she would catch his eye across the yard, and he would hold her gaze for a moment, and she knew what he was feeling because she could see it in the amber of his eyes. Not the absence of grief. Grief does not simply become absent, but the presence of something alongside it that was stronger. The presence of forward motion. The presence of hope that has decided to stay. The barn was framed by July. The working buildings followed through the summer, and by September the Stone Ranch had a new barn and a new smithy and new fence lines running clean and straight across the good Texas grass. And Amos bought 6 horses from a man in Lubbock, and Deke was hired on full time, and there was talk of building the herd back the following spring. Tate Cruz and his brother Harlan had made themselves scarce after the business with the judge, and showed no further interest in causing trouble, and the valley settled into the rhythms of a working community and a decent autumn. Susan's garden had given abundantly that first summer. Squash and beans and onions and tomatoes, and a row of corn that grew taller than expected. She had canned through August until her arms ached, and the root cellar was stocked past what they needed, and she had given the surplus to Hetty Prout and to Marta, and to 3 families on the north edge of town who had had a hard year with the drought. She had started teaching reading on Tuesday and Thursday evenings to 3 adults in town who had never had the chance to learn, including one of the Mexican farmhands named Ernesto, whose wife had asked Susan quietly if it was possible, and Susan had said of course it was possible, and she had meant it without qualification. Amos had watched this particular development with an admiration that he expressed primarily by making sure she had adequate lamplight in the evenings and always had coffee ready when she came home from town. In the early days of October, she sat at the kitchen table in the Stone house and watched the morning come through the windows and thought about the October a year ago, when she had ridden up this hill on a horse with a borrowed shoe and knocked on a door that had not been opened to visitors since the fire, and the man behind it had looked at her with bewilderment and let her in. She heard him in the bedroom, heard the particular sounds of him waking, the long exhale that was the first thing he did in the morning, the creak of the floorboards in the specific place near the window. She had learned the grammar of this house, its sounds and rhythms, in the way you learn a language when you live inside it. He came into the kitchen in his shirt and his boots and his sleep-loosened hair, and he looked at her sitting at the table and said good morning the way he said it every morning, which was quietly and with the directness that meant he was always glad she was there. She had something to tell him. She had been carrying it for 4 days, turning it over, and now the morning was right and the Stone house was warming around them and she was ready. "Amos," she said. He was at the stove with the coffee. He looked back at her. "Something on your mind," he said. "We're going to have a child," she said. He went very still. Not the still of a man who doesn't know what to do, but the still of a man whose whole self has paused to register something enormous. He set down the coffee pot and turned to face her completely, and she could see in his face everything she might have hoped to see: the shock first, and then something underneath the shock that was moving fast and wide like water released from a dam, something that was joy in its purest and most foundational form. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and sat down in the chair beside her, not across from her but beside her, and took her hands in both of his. "Susan," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "I know," she said. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and his grip on her hands was careful and firm, and she could feel that he was working through something vast and was not quite through it yet. "Are you?" he said, and stopped. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said. "Good, actually. A little tired in the mornings." "You should rest more," he said immediately. "I should continue to live my life," she said with gentle firmness. He looked at her, and something almost like his smile appeared, the real one, even through the hugeness of the moment. "Of course," he said. "Amos," she said, and squeezed his hands. "You are going to be a wonderful father." The thing that crossed his face then was complex and full, and she thought she understood it completely. It was the face of a man who is thinking about the people he lost, because joy like this always has that quality when grief is part of your story. It reaches back as well as forward. He was thinking about his father, she knew, and his mother and his brother, and about what it meant to carry something of them into what was being built here, this new life, this morning. This stone house with its 2 chairs at the table and its shelf of poetry books and its cold season root cellar and its rebuilt barn and its 6 good horses and its kitchen where coffee was always made and the door was always open. "I will try," he said, "with everything I have." "I know," she said. He kissed her forehead and held her for a moment the way you hold something you cannot believe you are lucky enough to hold. And outside the October sun was coming up over the east hills and lighting the Texas grassland in long gold lines. And somewhere on the Bancroft Vega land to the east Roberto was beginning his morning work. And in town, Hetty Prout was starting her washing. And Marta Vega was making her coffee. And Cooper was opening his smithy. And the valley was waking up into another ordinary beautiful day that was made up entirely of the things worth living for. The winter they had together, that second year, was different from the first. The stone house was full in a way it had not been full before, not crowded but occupied, inhabited by 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms and needs, and who moved through the shared days of it with the particular grace of people who choose each other consciously, not out of habit or convenience, but out of a clear-eyed and recurring decision to be present to each other. Susan's pregnancy was unremarkable in the best sense of the word. She was healthy and strong and continued to run her household and her Tuesday-Thursday teaching evenings, and to help with the ranch accounts through December and January, though she accepted Amos's help with the heavier outdoor work without making it a point of pride to refuse him. He was attentive without being hovering, helpful without being managing, and when she told him as much he said simply that he was trying to learn the difference, and she said she thought he had learned it. There were hard moments, too. In December, she received a letter from a woman in Amarillo who had been a colleague in her teaching years, a friendly letter full of town news, but it contained a passage about a man that Susan had almost married 7 years ago, who had moved on and married someone else and had 2 children and a prosperous dry goods business. She had read the passage twice, and then set the letter down and looked at the kitchen wall for a few minutes. Amos came in from the barn and looked at her and said nothing but sat down across from her and waited. "I almost married a man in Amarillo," she said, "before I came here." "I know," he said, which surprised her. "You know, Hetty Prout," he said. She should have known. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "No," he said. "Should it?" "I suppose not," she said. "I just wonder sometimes about the chain of things. He didn't want me to go west. He wanted me to stay in Amarillo and be a schoolteacher's wife and stay small." She paused. "I couldn't do it, and if I had, you would not have been here," Amos said. "No," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I am glad you couldn't do it," he said. "So am I," she said. Enormously. February came, and the nights were long and cold, and they kept each other warm and talked into the darkness about the things people talk about when they are truly known to each other. Their histories and their disappointments and the things they hoped for, and the small private fears they had not told anyone before. He told her about his brother, whose name had been Thomas, who had been 21 and who had been apprenticed to a carpenter in a town 20 miles east, and had come home for harvest week that November, and had been in the house when the fire started. Susan listened and did not flinch and did not try to make it smaller, and he was grateful for that in a way that was beyond words, though he tried anyway. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Susan was 23, and who had never entirely recovered from being left, and who had raised Susan with a combination of great love and great sorrow that had shaped Susan's own character in ways she was still discovering. The toughness was from her mother. The willingness to ride west alone was from her mother. The knowledge that a person can be sad and still be whole was from her mother too. "She sounds extraordinary," he said. "She was," Susan said. "She would have loved you." "I would have been afraid of her," he said. Susan laughed genuinely, and the sound of it in the dark was warm and real, Probably, she said, but she would have approved. She had very specific standards. What were they, he asked. That a man should be honest and steady and not be afraid of work, she said, and that he should look at me like I was worth looking at. He was quiet for a moment. I can do all of those things, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said yes. The baby was born in June, on a morning that was already warm when the sun came up, and he was a boy with dark hair and a set of lungs that announced him to the valley with authority. Bertie Graves came to the Stone house to help with the birth, along with Marta Vega, who had attended more births than she could count, and Amos was present through all of it, because Susan had asked him to be, and he would not have been anywhere else. When the boy was placed in Amos's arms, this large, quiet man who had carried so much loss for so long, he held the baby with the careful thoroughness that was characteristic of him, and looked down at the small red face with an expression that Susan, from where she lay propped against the pillows, watched and filed away in the deepest part of herself, and would not forget for as long as she lived. He named the boy Thomas Jacob Stone, for his brother and her father, and both of them thought that was exactly right. Thomas was a vigorous infant who slept in stretches that were not long enough but were earnest, and who regarded the world from his first weeks with the alert, dark-eyed attention that Amos recognized as his mother's, and that made him smile the real smile on a daily basis. The Stone house, which had been empty for so long and then had been 2 people and was now 3, seemed to settle deeper into the hill on which it sat, as though it had reached its proper weight at last. Hetty Prout arrived the day after the birth with food enough for a week, and told Susan she had done magnificently, and told Amos he had better not let his wife do too much too soon, and Amos said he was doing his best, and Hetty said his best had better be extraordinary, and he said he would aim for that, and they regarded each other with the mutual respect of 2 strong personalities who had arrived at a working armistice. Summer moved on in the way Texas summers do, with long hot days and the particular beauty of the prairie at evening when the heat breaks and the air goes golden, and the insects sing in the tall grass. Amos expanded the herd that summer, buying 20 longhorn cattle from a ranch outside of Lubbock, and by September the Stone Ranch had the look and the feel of a working place, a going concern, something that was alive. Susan had started writing. She did not speak of it much at first. It was something she did in the early mornings before Thomas woke, small, careful notes in a journal about the land and the seasons and the people of Crayle's Hollow. She had the instinct and the training of a teacher for precise description, and what she wrote was good. She knew it was good the way you know certain things about yourself without needing to be told. After several months she mentioned it to Amos. He asked to read what she had written. She gave him the journal with a certain uncertainty that she recognized as the particular vulnerability of showing something you have made to someone whose opinion you care about above all others. He read for a long time at the kitchen table after supper while she fed Thomas in the other room, and when he came to the door of the bedroom, he had the journal in his hand and his expression was clear and certain. "You should send this somewhere," he said. "A newspaper. There are papers in San Antonio and Fort Worth that run pieces about frontier life." "You think it's good enough," she said. "I think it's better than good enough," he said. "I think it's the truth written down very precisely, and that is harder than almost anything." She sent 3 pieces to the San Antonio Express that autumn. 2 were accepted and printed, and she received a letter of interest and a small payment that she showed to Amos with an expression she could not quite keep contained, and he lifted her off the floor with Thomas tucked between them, and she laughed, and Thomas looked bewildered, and it was one of the best moments of a year that had been full of best moments. The autumn passed, and the second winter of their marriage came in with dry, cold, and clear skies, and the wood was laid in early, and the root cellar was stocked, and the ranch was sound. Amos had hired 2 full-time hands by then, Deke, who had been there from the beginning, and a young man named Paul who had come through Crayle's Hollow on his way to somewhere else, and been offered work and stayed. The Stone Ranch was not yet what it had been at its height, under 3 generations of building, but it was solid and growing and pointed in the right direction. Thomas took his first steps in November, on a Thursday afternoon in the kitchen, while Amos was making coffee and Susan was writing at the table, and he crossed the 4 feet between his mother's knee and his father's leg with a determined wobbling intensity that made both of them go entirely still so as not to startle him. And when he reached Amos and grabbed onto his trouser leg with both hands and looked up at him with unmistakable triumph, Amos picked him up and held him up to look at him squarely and said, "Well done, son," with so much quiet joy in his voice that Susan had to look at her paper for a moment and collect herself. Christmas that year was full in the way Christmas becomes when there is a child in the house who is old enough to understand something is different and wonderful. Susan hung the old scrap of red ribbon on the cedar branch she brought in and set it on the table, and Thomas reached for it with both hands, and she let him hold it for a while. "This ribbon was on the first Christmas tree you ever made for me," she told Amos. "The worst Christmas tree in Crayle's Hollow," he said. "The best one I ever had," she said. He looked at her across the table in the candlelight with Thomas on his knee pulling at the ribbon, and what was in his face was everything she had hoped for when she rode west on a roan horse in the wrong season on a road she did not know, looking for something she could not entirely name but recognized the moment she found it. "I opened the door," he said, "without knowing why." "I know," she said. "I know why now," he said. Outside the stone house, the Texas winter was doing what it did, moving across the flat land in cold, clear waves, and the stars above Crayle's Hollow were thick and bright the way they are when the air is clean and dry, and inside the warmth was particular and specific and earned. The fire in the hearth was steady and giving good light, and the amber in Amos Stone's eyes was warm and sure, and Susan Stone held her husband's gaze across the table with the conviction of a woman who has ridden a long road and arrived exactly where she was meant to be. The valley they had not known was home had become home in the way that things become real, gradually and then entirely, through the accumulation of ordinary days lived with honesty and care. There would be more seasons, more mornings with coffee made before she woke, more evenings with her reading aloud and him listening with his elbows on his knees, more work and more harvest and more letters to newspapers and more cattle added to the herd, and more fence lines run straight and clean across the good Texas grass. There would be Thomas learning to ride and Thomas going to school, eventually in the proper schoolhouse that the town would build in the spring of 1881, the campaign for which Susan led herself with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had once been a school teacher and had opinions about what children deserved. There would be another child, a daughter they would name Clara, born in the spring of 1882, who would have her father's amber eyes and her mother's refusal to accept silence as a final answer. There would be years of it, good honest years, the kind that you do not recognize as the best of your life while you are in them, but that you know when you look back are exactly that. There would be the morning, many years later, when Amos would stand at the kitchen window of the stone house and look at the rebuilt ranch, the full barn, the good herd, the fence lines running to the horizon, and feel the particular peace of a man who has done the work and it has been enough, and who knows that the people he lost are not gone from this place, but present in every stone and every board and every season's turning. And there would be Susan beside him at the window, her hand in his, looking at the same land with the same knowledge and the same gratitude and the same clear-eyed love that had started on a cold October morning when she raised her knuckles to a door that had not been opened to visitors since the fire and knocked, once, twice, 3 times, firm and deliberate, because she had never in her life let silence be the final answer. The door had opened, and from that opening everything else had grown.